turn out, and you're clearly all ready for a revolt and a revolution. I very much hope there won't be further sort tonight, so please do take that into account and don't overreact. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Roger Ball and Steve Paul from the University of Western England, and we're really thrilled to be part of a national project looking at the riots of 1831. So I'll hand over to you then, Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm finished. So Dr. Roger Ball here, and myself, and Professor John Drury, University of Sussex, and our administrator Jane Askew are all working on this fabulous project, funded for 3 years by the Economic and Social Research Council, where we're asking, I hope, some sort of fresh questions about what was going on in the 1831 reform riots, and we're interested in them particularly because there were some of the most popular, best attended. They were some of the most serious riots. Certainly, the 3-day event in Bristol in 1831 was the most serious social disturbance in 19th century England, I think, without a doubt. So they're not very well understood. They're extremely well documented. It's just that no one really seems to understand what was going on in them. So that's really what we're about, and we're looking at a series of case studies around, mostly in the southwest, not venturing any further north than Worcester. And Blandford, of course, is right on our map, and for reasons I will explain to you in a moment. So, what I intend to do is, this is the sort of rough structure for what I want to talk about. We can't just kick in and start talking about rioting in Blandford, because you have to have some context. You remember that from when you were at school. You have to have context. And so I'm going to give you some context first of all, and the first bit of context I want to give you is about the 1831 parliamentary reform movement, or from 1830 to 1832 really, a movement for parliamentary reform. Why did that produce disturbances? Why was it so fractious? Why was it fought over? What was the problem there? So we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on in those years, and a little introduction to the unreformed electorate. That's people who could vote at the time of the Blandford riot. Then we need to look at a local context. You're probably already familiar with this, but as I expect you already know, the Blandford riot was connected, not completely, but certainly influenced by events going on in the wider county of Dorset in October 1831, a by-election, a fiercely fought by-election. So we're going to have a quick look at that as well. Then we're going to have a look at Blandford itself. What kind of a town was Blandford? What kind of, in brief terms, but what was the structure and authority of Blandford? What's it like as a 19th century town? Then we'll go through in detail what happens during the riot itself, and then I've just picked a few things that I think are interesting that we learned from studying this, and we'll perhaps go through those at the end, and then I will shut up and go away.
Until tomorrow.
Until tomorrow, yes, absolutely, yeah, until tomorrow. There's a walk tomorrow. If anybody wants to do a walk around the town, you already know extremely better than I do. You can lead me, or I can lead you, and we're going to go from the museum, that's right, outside the museum, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'll be, it's the same talk actually, but it's a kind of a peripatetic talk. We should be walking as we go, pedestrian talk. Right, so, what's the first thing? We're going to talk about 1831 and the unreformed electorate. I expect you already know, you say, what was wrong with, voting rights in the early 19th century? Well, they weren't very fair. We weren't living in a democracy. That's true. How bad was it? Here's England and Wales, and at the time of these disturbances of which we speak in 1831, England and Wales had a population approaching 14 million people. How many people out of those 14 million had a right to vote in parliamentary elections? About 344,000. Not terribly many. But the other thing was, it's not just that there weren't enough people who could vote. and don't even think about women voting. I mean, this is just about blokes we're trying to get the vote for here. It's not just that it's unfair, it's that the voting qualifications are not uniform. So whether you could vote or not vote in most English towns depended very much on some ancient charter that had been delivered to you by a king or a queen in the days of yore, which stipulated who could vote and who couldn't. So it's different from town to town. No uniformity. So here's an example. Bristol, a town I'm very familiar with, the second city, as it used to call itself before Birmingham assumed that mantle, or Liverpool. 100,000 people by 1831 living in and around Bristol. How many people in Bristol could vote in a general election? 5,600, and they elected 2 MPs between them. And you're thinking, blimey, that's not very good, is it? Bristol is one of the highest electorates in the country. It was a freeman electorate. If you were a freeman of the borough, you could vote, and you could make freemen every time there was an election. So the electorate actually went up every time there was a contested election. But still, only 5,600 people qualified. Let's compare that with a place just down the road, Bath. Bath, like 9 miles down the road from Bristol, one of the fastest growing spa towns in Europe. Even by 1831, it's in decline a little by 1831, but about 50,000 people lived and worked in the city of Bath. How many? It should be about half the number who could vote in Bristol, I suppose, but unfortunately it's only 30. And the 30 people who could vote in Bath were simply the unaccountable, unelected members of the corporation, or the city council. And they do elect 2 MPs between them. They just sort of met one evening and decided who it should be. Bath had freemen, but freemen couldn't vote. In Bristol they could. So this is just an example of how ununiform the electoral system was, and why people might have thought it needed changing. And then you're thinking, yeah, Bristol, Bath, that's all very well. But surely the great thing about the 1830s must have been the Industrial Revolution. The Midlands, the industrial north, the big industrial towns where people were flocking from the south to the north. So what about what's going on in the north? Like places like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield. I'm not even going to try and count how many people who lived in these growing towns. What was the representation for any of these towns? None. There are no electors in any of those towns. They elect no MPs in any of those towns. Although I've just put in brackets there, except the counties, because the complication, you don't want to get bogged down in this, but the complication was that every county in England, north, south, wherever you were, also elected 2 MPs. And there was a uniform franchise in the counties. So the counties, anyone who was a 40 shilling freeholder, that is anybody in possession of property worth 40 shillings a year or more, could vote in the county. But that meant, local representation is absent. So there was 2 MPs elected for the West Riding of Yorkshire, say, and 2 for Lancashire, right? But that doesn't really mean that Manchester and Liverpool were well represented. So that's the anomaly. We're talking about towns mostly here. As I say, so there's the issues that arise out of this. You think, well, why did everything kick off in the 1830s? Well, it didn't have to be the 1830s, but it's an early 19th century kind of something waiting to happen. Industrialisation, urbanisation, growing populations in mass towns with no representation. It's all growing. A sense that there's a north-south divide in the country, becoming more and more apparent. And you've got particularly this kind of very assertive, opinionated middle class, the people who run the factories, the people who engineer the industrial revolution, or they think they do. It's the workers who really do it, isn't it? But the middle class sort of pay for it and organise it and invest in it. And they're thinking to themselves, here we are, captains of industry, forging ahead, bringing new empire, and we still can't vote. Not fair. So the middle class are the movers and shakers in some ways behind attempts to start a reform movement. So, how is old corruption? The reformers often refer to the parliamentary system as old corruption, sort of tongue-in-cheek term for it, really. It was pretty corrupt. So this is just want to go through what was sort of the pace of activity from 1830 onwards. We've got a Tory government led by the Duke of Wellington, hero of Waterloo, a staunch opponent of reform in any shape, very traditional gentleman. So in January of 1830 we start to see a phenomenon which will sweep across the country, the formation of something called political unions. These are attempts to unite middle and working class disenfranchised people in a campaign for parliamentary reform. They argue, of course, about how far the reform should go, but the political unions are an important, popular political organisation. They pop up all over the country. And there's things going on elsewhere. So in France, in May 1830, the French have their second revolution. Eugene Delacroix's famous painting of liberty leading the people to the barricades, very romantic image, but it catches the mood somehow, doesn't it? They overthrew the Bourbon monarchy and brought in what many suspected would be, or the middle class certainly hoped would be, a sort of a bourgeois monarchy, a tailcoat-wearing monarchy, a top hat and tailcoat king, Louis Philippe. So there's a sort of a sense, oh, going over there, we should have a bit of that over here. And what did we get? We get a new king too. But we didn't have to have a revolution to acquire ours. William IV. And contrary to the image, the picture here, you wouldn't think it, but William IV kind of advertises himself as a clean, a new broom, someone who will sweep away the corruption, somebody who is in favour of reform. I mean, pretty limited reform, I expect. But he too liked to walk around in sort of tailcoat and top hat. You know, or liked to walk around too much in robes. So there's a kind of that sort of also gives a bit of a push to the movement. And then shortly after the new reign begins, there's an election, and the Tories find themselves severely weakened in it. Their majority is starting to slip. The Whig Party, who've been out of office for years, suddenly realised reform is something we could organise around, and maybe we could catch the public mood, we can get ourselves elected as the Reform Party. And it starts to work. Just as a signal that clearly things are not well in the British ancien regime at this time, the country is racked with agricultural rioting, the Captain Swing rebellion, from the summer way up into December. And it's not the Swing rebellion of agricultural labourers looking for a better deal, basically, a better working conditions, pay, and so on. It's not that was directly linked to the reform campaign, but it is another kind of sign that things are not well. In November 1830, Wellington's government, already weakened at the last election, falls. They get themselves into a right old mess over things like Catholic emancipation in particular. And the Tories fall apart over that, and a coalition government is established by the King. So we've got a few more Whigs starting to feel their way into government. 1831 dawns, and the Whigs, Lord Grey there, puts in the first reform bill. He tentatively puts it in the Commons, and the Tories, who are implacably opposed to reform of any kind, sabotage it in committee stage, and so it fails. What do the Whigs do? They say, right, we dissolve Parliament. We get the King to dissolve Parliament. Because if we can have a general election now, we know we'll get a landslide majority. People are fed up with the Tories kicking things out, and everybody knows, it's a very topical, isn't it? What do you think? Well, anyway, so they demand a general election, and they get one, and there is a Whig pro-reform landslide result. So the Whigs, in a position of great power and influence, put in their second reform bill. They put it through the House of Commons, no problem. They have to get it through the House of Lords. Oh dear, the House of Lords is full of anti-reform Tories. On the 8th of October 1831, the House of Lords throw the reform bill out. There is consternation in the country. people didn't think of themselves as Democrats in those days, and we were light years away from democracy. But still, people understand when things are not right. And for a small number of aristocratic lords to kick out the People's Reform Bill was not welcome. So we have a constitutional crisis on our hands. What will happen next? Well, from our point of view, what we're interested in is popular responses, and popular responses become quite fraught. So this is the 10th of October 1831. Duke of Newcastle's palatial residence in Nottingham Castle on fire. A crowd emerges in Nottingham and riots, destroys some buildings, smashes windows, attacks supporters of the Tory party. Look, it's not just Nottingham. The first outbreak is in Derby on the same day that the Lords kicked the bill out. And now this isn't working. What's going on? Oh, it's got a delay. So 9th of October, they start rioting in Nottingham. 10th of October, it's Loughborough and Mansfield. 11th of October, now we're getting into Dorset. What? Dorset, yeah. Don't want to get left behind. Derby, Nottingham, Dorset, so it just runs off, doesn't it? Parkstone and Poole on the 11th. Blandford on the 15th. What's this?
Power of the people.
Yeah, exactly. On the 19th, Sherborne. On the 21st, Yeovil, I know it's not in Dorset, but it's nearly in Dorset, isn't it? Not far off. 29th of October, Bristol. There are a few more after that. But the question we want to come back to is, why Dorset? So, why Dorset? Yes, that's 3 riots in Dorset, and one of them, another in Yeovil, very nearby. So, I said to you there was an important by-election going on. Now, the point about the by-election is it's going on just at the time that the second Reform Bill is being introduced to first the Commons and then the Lords. Polling begins on the 30th of September, ends on the 17th of October. So, right in the middle of it, the Lords kick the Reform Bill out. And it's brought about, this is for the county, so this is for 40-shilling freeholders to vote in. So there will have been some voters in Blandford, there will have been some voters in Sherborne, and so on, all right? And it came about as a by-election because one of the sitting 2 MPs committed suicide, and so there was a contest for his seat. And it was fought between this man, William Ponsonby, an advocate of reform, and this man, Lord Ashley. You only got to look at him to see that he was not an advocate of reform, because he wasn't terribly keen on reform. He was an absolute opponent, outright opponent of reform. So it's an extremely, as I said on the little slide there, many people saw this as a struggle in microcosm of the wider reform movement in the country. If the Tories could win this seat, they would be able to turn around to the rest of the country and say, there you are! Nobody's keen on it. See, it doesn't work. We're not interested in reform. On the other hand, if the reformers can win it, then it's a shot in the arm for the reform movement. Well, on the 17th of October, Lord Ashley won the seat by 36 votes, but very hotly contested votes they were too. 36 votes is pretty tiny majority. There were all sorts of allegations flying about the behaviour of his election committee. He has a lot of very powerful lawyers working for him, and Ponsonby did too, but they were probably both at this to a certain extent. But Ashley in particular is accused of hiring lawyers to disqualify pro-reform voters. So when you went to vote in those days, because it was public, you had to just go in and attest to who you were. You had to prove you were a 40-shilling freeholder. And so they have assessors who look at the and I say, well, where's your property then? Or you go, no, that's mortgage, that doesn't count. No, it's not mortgage, it's only a little bit mortgage, no, you can't vote. So there's a lot of that going on the polling field. as one newspaper put it, actually won through the trickery of the lawyers and the partiality of the assessor. So there is a big groundswell of disaffection with the system over Ashley's victory. Right, so that's what's going on. Let's have a look at Blandford itself. So Blandford in 1831 is a town with a population of about 3,000 people. They don't have an electorate either. It's a borough with a what do you call it? With it's a borough with a charter. That's it. Yes, a borough with a charter, and none of them have the right to vote. No one in the town has the right to vote except for the county, as I said before. So the 40-shilling freeholders can vote for the county seat, but there is no representation as a borough for Blandford itself. It's run by an unelected 10-man corporation. They elect one another, basically. If somebody dies, they co-opt. They have at their head a bailiff. He's a sort of a mayor, but they call him the bailiff. The charter, it's all that the charter says, we'll call him a bailiff. And in 1831, it's Reverend George Chard, who lived in the vicarage just around the corner here. They have a town clerk and they have 2 constables. So law and order is not that easy to maintain when you've only got that many people with which to do it. I've just taken here a comment from the report of the Parliamentary Commission on Municipal Corporations in 1834 when they were interested in reforming local government. A great inconvenience is felt at Blandford from the unruly state of the population, from the want of a municipal authority, and from the defect of the constabulary force in that borough, in that part of town which is out of the borough. Population beyond the bounds of the borough is of a description which requires more control than that which is within it. So there was obviously a concern that Blandford was a disorderly town, but its infrastructure isn't really dealing with the problem. So they were talking about people living inside and outside of the borough there. So I think it's helpful to have a look at a tide map of the town. Here we are. That red line there represents the boundaries of the borough as dictated by the charter. And so, as you can see, since the charter was granted and the borough created, although originally the church was sort of central, by 1831 there's been a lot of development up the Salisbury Road in particular, and the Shaftesbury Road too, off up into the north and the west. And a lot of wealthy people had been building large villas up there, but they were obviously, that municipal corporations report was interested in some of the poorer people who also lived outside the borough. But basically the problem for the bailiff and his 2 constables is that they don't have any jurisdiction outside the borough. They don't have much jurisdiction anyway, but outside the borough they haven't got any. This will become an issue during the riot, as we shall see. So it's not that there is no authority anywhere to be had nearby. There are justices of the peace, magistrates, commissioned magistrates for the county, living very close to Blandford. Not in Blandford, they don't want to live in Blandford, but they don't mind living just outside. So Edward Berkeley Portman, in Bryanston House, now the school of course, but then his sumptuous acreage. John Smith Jr. and John Wildboar Smith, father and son, they live at the Down House, now demolished. That used to be at Blandford St Mary. And there's County Sheriff James John Farquharson of Langton House. Not a young man. John Smith Jr.'s wife refers to him at one point in some correspondence as Old Fargy. So perhaps not the most dynamic magistrate in the county. And these people, when they say, oh, these people live nearby, then it's not that they didn't live nearby like you and I might live nearby one another. I mean, these people lived in rather kind of more sumptuous surroundings. They live nearby. They're completely cut off from the world around them in their own estates, aren't they? You have to think twice about marching up to up to the front door and knocking on it and saying, "Excuse me, as a magistrate, I've got a bit of trouble." But these are their delightful piles. Anyway, so there are justices of the peace nearby. But let's have a look. So bear in mind, Blandford seems to be a sort of a dysfunctional community in some respects, certainly from the point of view of maintenance of order. Let's have a look at what happened in Blandford during the election, because I think this is the only place in Dorset to which this applies. From the 2nd of October onwards, local magnates were writing to central government complaining that there was window breaking and disorder breaking out in the town. Obviously not very serious. No one was arrested for anything. But there was... what apparently was going on was that voting takes place in Dorchester. And people could go down to Dorchester, vote, and then come back up. And every day there's a crowd waiting outside the Crown Hotel for the mail coach to arrive from Dorchester. And the mail coach tells people what the state of the poll is. And that's like today, we do all the voting on a single day, but you could keep it going for 2 weeks in those days, because you had to get out voters in from elsewhere. You had to get persuaded to come up from London. Oh, I've got a 40-shilling freehold in Stirlingshire or something. We need to get you up to Dorchester to vote. So it could go on for 2 weeks, and this one did. So there was trouble breaking out from the 2nd of October, sort of 2 days after the election began, sporadically. And then on the 15th of October, this is still 2 days before the result was announced, on Market Day, Saturday, so I've got a nice picture of Market Day, I hope you appreciate the convergence there. On Market Day, a man called Richard Shetler was recognised in the town as a supporter of Lord Ashley. He was a farmer from Hazelbury Bryan. And a crowd sort of surround him and chase him. They beat him. They follow him. He tries to take refuge in a pub. He gets thumped. He has to lock himself in an upstairs room for about 3 hours until eventually the crowd disappears. And they're shouting out, "Duck him in the shower! Tie him up!" And I suppose the point about this is, this wasn't really a riot as such. It's not referred to as one of the riots, that took place in Blandford from the 17th onwards. But it was a pretty sure sign that law and order hung by a pretty slender thread, I think, because nothing, at the time, nothing happens as a result of Shetler's rather unpleasant experience. The following day, as I said to you, there's a mayor, George Chard, Reverend George Chard, Vicar of Blandford. He thinks to himself, right, we're going to have to do something about this. So what we want is some military support. So he summons 2 JPs in the morning to the Crown Hotel for a sort of summit meeting. And he asks Edward Bartley Portman from Bryanston House and John Smith Senior from the Down House. Now, he's made a mistake there, because both of these 2 magistrates, I mean, you shouldn't be a mistake, all right, because they're meant to be impartial, but these 2 magistrates are both pro-reform. So they're not really very interested in sort of doubling down on reformers. So he said, look, we know the towns, look at what happened to Mr. Shitlow yesterday, we can't have that going on, this is terrible. We need some assistance, we need military support now, we need to bring the soldiers in. He said, could you please request to the Home Office or War Office, get some soldiers in. And they both look at him and they say, you are overreacting. There's no need, there's absolutely no need. Look, you just have to enrol some special constables, volunteer constables. Give them a baton and an armband, and that's all you need to do. So he goes, well, I'm not happy. So he had a rather sleepless night. And tossing around, he gets up sort of in the middle of the night and writes a letter to the Home Secretary saying, I have asked the JPs to act, they won't act. So I'm writing to you as the Mayor of Blandford, and I'm asking you to send some troops. And he gets a message back saying the 3rd Dragoon Guards will be available. All right. So he gets to sleep, but then it's the day of the announcement of the election result, Monday, 17th of October. What happens? First thing in the morning, a crowd forms on the bridge over the Stour and blockades it. Why? To stop anyone who hasn't yet voted travelling down to Dorchester in order to vote. They just stopping any Tory or anti-reform voters from getting down to Dorchester to vote. So they blockade the bridge. Meanwhile, the mayor calls a town hall meeting in order to recruit special constables, as he has been advised by the two magistrates. So at 10 o'clock in the morning, he unlocks the town hall, and hopefully people will come in and enrol. But the only people who go in there are a crowd of reformers who take over the building, refuse to let the meeting take place. I think they break a window and eventually ordered out. But this attempt to recruit special constables fails dismally. No one turns up, and the meeting collapses. So Charles he's got soldiers on their way, but that's all he's got. Then later in the morning at the Greyhound Inn, the Greyhound Inn was not only a sort of important coaching inn at the time, it was also Lord Ashley's committee rooms. So it was associated with anti-reform. It was associated with Ashley's campaign in particular. I suspect that the reason the crowds always gathered around the Crown to find out how the election was going rather than the Greyhound was because they thought the Crown was not a Tory stronghold, but the Greyhound was. Don't really know about that, but it seems sensible somehow. Later in the morning, on the 17th, again this is before the election result has been announced, a large crowd, 50 to 100 people, gather outside the Greyhound Inn, and as various magistrates, who are, I think, probably also members of Ashley's committee, try to arrive and get into the building, they're prevented from getting in. They both do eventually get in, but they're assaulted on their way. So William Hannam and John Bastard are both claim anyway that they're assaulted on their way into the building, and once they're in there, they don't come out again for rather a long time. There's a crowd outside telling them to go home. So clearly things are starting to kick off a little bit. It's very, very tense. In the afternoon, Reverend Chard, looking out of the window of the Greyhound Hotel, thinks to himself, I think I better call up those Dragoon Guards. Now, it's just worth noting that the Dragoon Guards are no-nonsense people. You don't want to mess about with the 3rd Dragoon Guards. As the rioters in Bristol discovered to their cost, just a week later, it was the 3rd Dragoon Guards who rode crazily through the centre of Queen Square, slashing and cutting and shooting at just about anybody out on the streets. These guys, once they're let off the leash, mean business. So George Chard has got to think to himself, and he knows this. I mean, these aren't the Yeomanry. They're not just sort of farmers in uniforms and someone's given them a sword to play with. These guys are regular soldiers. And Chard's got to think to himself, I've got them here, they look menacing, but there's that kind of moment, isn't there, when you think, how far do we go with this? What's the consequence of letting them actually go into action? Well, in any case, he doesn't have to worry for very long, because the commanding officer of the guards walks up to him and says, well, you're just a bailiff of Blandford, and we can't act unless a magistrate reads the Riot Act. Right? Yeah, that's the rule. You can't have soldiers just riding willy-nilly through crowds. The Riot Act must be read, and it must be read in a proper manner so that the crowd can hear it. It must be read by a county magistrate. And so John goes, so the commanding officer says, well, don't worry, I'll go and find a magistrate. So he rides off to Bryanston House to see Edward Berkeley Portman. We already know what Portman thinks. So he meets Edward Berkeley Portman, who tells him that he said, I didn't summon you, I don't know what you're doing here, take your men and leave. We can deal with this ourselves. We just need a few special constables. So then, of course, the great moment arrives. Between about 6:30 and 7 o'clock in the evening, the mail coach arrives outside the Crown, there it is, with news that Lord Ashley has won by 36 disputed votes. Within minutes, this angry crowd marches straight up West Street to George Moore's house. George Moore was one of Lord Ashley's principal attorneys, a very wealthy fellow indeed, and held more responsible than any other, I think, for this kind of disqualification of pro-reform voters. They also go to this house. That's the house of Septimus Smith, another of Lord Ashley's attorneys, whose job it is to disqualify and question pro-reform voters. He lives there, you know the house. There isn't the picture of George Moore's house, because it's got knocked down, as I expect you know. There's a modern house there now, I cannot find a contemporary illustration of his house, so we'll have to go without, so we'll imagine. But I should think it looks a decent size, doesn't it? What do they do there? They smash windows. They gather outside, they break windows, they break the shuttering, they try to kick the doors down, they break down the garden wall. There's a restraint about what they do, I think. They don't enter immediately, but they do a lot of damage to the windows. Both of these houses. And then they move down to George Chard's house, the bailiff's house, the vicarage. And they do the same to that. They break the windows, they attack the shuttering, they break into the back garden, they kick at the doors, they do as much damage as they can from outside the house. At this point, Bailiff Chard discovers or remembers that because he is the bailiff, by charter, he is empowered to read the Riot Act himself. So he summons the dragoons again and tells them that he will do this. Although the dragoons, I think the commanding officer and he have a conversation about how far his jurisdiction might reach. And of course the problem is it doesn't reach any further than the borough boundary. So George Moore's house is still not safe, although those inside it technically just about might be. Anyway, he reads the Riot Act outside the vicarage. The dragoons advance towards the crowd. The crowd disperse quite easily but run to the north beyond the borough boundary. This therefore creates a state of escalation. This is always a question, see, what happens when you introduce soldiers to a civil disturbance? What happens? It might work, or it might get worse. In this instance, it got worse. They go back to Moore's house, which is outside the soldiers' jurisdiction, or mayor's jurisdiction, so obviously thinking the soldiers can't act against us here, and they do some real damage. They give it a right going over, and they break in. They get inside and they get into his office and they look through all his title deeds, all the things that make his job real, and they pull it all out and they throw it on the lawn, they rip it up and they set fire to it and they destroy it. They don't do any other damage. I mean, they smash some furniture, I think, a little furniture, but there's still this interesting kind of sort of restraint. It's targeted, I suppose. We'll come back to this later, but I think we can see that they're quite careful about what they do. There's a method to their madness. So things are going not terribly well. The corporation gather quickly, I don't know where, the Crown perhaps, or somewhere, and they jointly sign this note. So the note has survived. It's in the Dorset archives, Dorchester. You can see them all signing it, and I've translated a bit for you here. It's very quickly sent to Sir John Smith Jr., the younger of the two Smiths, who is an anti-reformer. His dad's a reformer, he's an anti-reformer, at the Down House, just outside the town. We, the undersigned, earnestly beg you to assist us by your presence and sanction. Mr. Moore's, Mr. Smith's, and Mr. Child's houses are nearly demolished, but the commanding officer says he cannot act out of the borough without the sanction of a county magistrate. So please, Mr. Smith, come down and help us. And he does. Smith Jr. gets on his horse, and comes down, finds the crowd outside. Septimus, and there's too many Smiths, right? But John Smith Jr. is the magistrate. Septimus Smith is the attorney whose house is being attacked as he arrives. And he has the dragoons drawn up, and he says to the crowd, right, you must go home, this is getting out of control. I will read the riot act, and the dragoons will act. And in the middle of this negotiation that he's trying to do with the crowd and with the dragoons, in marches Edward Barclay Portman. Who invited him, nobody knows. But he arrives on his horse to see what's going on. And he very slowly works his horse into the crowd without hurting anyone. And he said, what's going on here? Now, according to Smith, who wrote later to the Home Secretary to explain what happened, as far as I could hear, Mr. Portman told them that he had not been accessory to sending for the military, for as far as he knew them, he believed they did not require a military force to prevent them from disturbing the peace. That was helpful, wasn't it? So just as Smith is trying to sort of get some sort of balance going here and disperse the crowd with the threat of military action, Portman comes along and says, "There's all soldiers here. Soldiers shouldn't be here. We don't need soldiers here." Who? Hands up if you think we need soldiers here. No, we don't need soldiers here. Smith's wife, writing a letter later, says, "Mr. Portman advised them to disperse, but while saying aloud, 'Let those who have called in the military abide by the consequences. I will have nothing more to do with it.' John could not stop him. But of course, the people cried, 'Hurrah for Portman! Portman's on our side!' So there's an interesting thing here, obviously a division amongst the magistrates about how you deal with a disorderly crowd. And Portman, I mean, part of his attitude, I think, here is that, if we let the military off the leash, what are the consequences of having the dragoons get their swords and ride through the crowd? What are the consequences? They'll be gone in the morning, and then we'll be here having to pick up the pieces at the end. The community memory of this event will not be good. So there is a sort of there's a sense, in a way, of him wanting to persuade the crowd. He does his best to persuade the crowd to go home. He wants to be their friend. And they do go home shortly after that. But they've already done so much damage to Septimus Smith's house and to George Moore's house that the magistrates have got to think, well, what are we going to do the following day? So Tuesday dawns. This is the Greyhound Hotel again, on the right, of course. And from early in the morning, a group of county magistrates sit in the Guildhall, issuing warrants for arrests, examining witnesses, examining prisoners, people who had been picked up overnight, and try to enrol some more special constables, some special constables. But as Smith wrote later, it was still impossible, owing to the backwardness of the inhabitants, to get anything together like an effective civil force. No persons volunteering to be sworn in as special constables. No person, not a single. Shame on you lot. Not one of you willing to stand up and defend your town. You live in the mob, right? In the evening, the crowd, obviously not interfered with, slowly grows during the day. The magistrates are in there. They're trying to put warrants together for arrests. They're examining prisoners. They're trying to enrol special constables. Let's mess it up for them. Let's gather in great quantities out here. And as the gathering gets bigger and it starts to get dark, some stones are thrown and several windows in the Greyhound Hotel are broken. Smith, the magistrate, Smith Jr., comes out of the hotel to read the riot act. And then a rather kind of farcical situation occurs. It's too dark. The riot act had to be read. Right? It was a piece of legislation that had to be read, ordering people to disperse on pain of being arrested for a capital felony if they're still standing there refusing to disperse an hour after it's been read. So you get an hour's grace. It doesn't mean you can't be arrested in between, but you're only guilty of a capital felony of riot if you're still standing there an hour later. And it has to be read. People have to have heard it. So Smith comes out and he goes, "Right, shut up, you lot! I've got a riot act here!" And he holds it up and it's too dark to read it. So he says to a soldier, "Somebody get a lantern." So the soldier goes into the hotel, comes out with a lantern and holds it up while Smith gets his riot act out again. He goes, "Right, shut up, I'm going to read the riot act now." And he's just about to do that when somebody runs, a man called William Baker, runs forward with a stick and smashes the lantern out of the soldier's hand. So Smith says, "I saw that, you're under arrest." The soldiers arrest William Baker, and they have to have another go and get another lantern, and eventually they do manage to read the riot act. But as Smith Jr. goes on to say, that's Smith, the magistrate, "The mob did not disperse after the riot act had been read, but continued parading the town, shouting, 'Reform! Ponsonby forever!'" Remember, he's the unsuccessful candidate in the election. "Down with the boroughmongers!" People who buy and sell parliamentary representation, in other words. So I've just put this bit in the map up so you can see. So basically what they do is the crowd disperse, or some of the crowd come away from the Greyhound Inn and go straight up West Street, Salisbury Street, towards more houses of more wealthy people higher up the road. In Salisbury Street, and I haven't been able to find out where Colonel Stewart or Colonel Cleveland lived. If anyone knows, do tell us. Or even who they were, actually. I haven't got very far with that. But anyway, it's discovered that the crowd are starting to attack Colonel Stewart's house and Colonel Cleveland's house. So the dragoons are sent up from the Greyhound. The riot act has now been read, so they can act. They canter up the street, and the crowd see them, and the crowd disperse very quickly. But then the dragoons are withdrawn, and the crowd then reforms and attacks Moore's house. Yet again, there can't have been much left to attack in Moore's house, but they go in and give it another good pasting. At which point the dragoons are ordered back up the street for second or third time. But something very interesting now happens. The crowd, having been provoked, if you like, or challenged by the dragoons more than once, suddenly decide not to run. And they stand their ground and combat them. Now, I put these two pictures up because these are both in Salisbury Street. Some of you will recognise where those are. But these are what we call entries, aren't they? It's an urban environment with lots of little passages and alleyways and yards and entries, which mounted cavalry, however skilled and professional they are, will not find it that easy to operate in. They're not trained for street fighting on horseback, trying to get in and out of spaces like that. Can you imagine? So, to some extent, the terrain favours the rioters, who also know the town better than the dragoons do. Mrs. Smith, the magistrate's wife, writes afterwards, "The streets were still full of people, and as stones were thrown in all directions at the military, it was necessary to disperse the mob and clear the streets without any further ceremony." So the gloves are off, no standing back. If you throw rocks at the 3rd Dragoons, they will not just sit there and take it. Stones were thrown from windows and doors, she writes, as well as from behind walls and down passages and alleys. So the crowd are not stupid enough to stand out in the middle of the road. They're getting under cover and they're tackling the soldiers. Soldiers are having a bit of a difficult time, I think, probably. And then we get to Anchor Yard. This, I think, is where the biggest conflict takes place. Mrs. Smith, again, very good of her to write all this out. She writes afterwards, "Mr. Smith," that's my husband, "received a severe cut in the head from a stone. The military proceeded to clear the streets by force, and in 1 or 2 instances were obliged to fire a few shots to disperse the mob, particularly near the Lancastrian school," which is just up above, just a little, very close to Anchor Yard. "The military were so severely pelted from a passage called the Anchor Yard that it was found necessary to clear it. But when the cavalry rode in, they found the passage obstructed by a cart filled with bricks, which had been moved across it." That's a barricade. From behind which they continued to pelt the soldiers. Orders were given to fire, and the passage was then cleared, whilst a dismounted party removed the cart. Dismounted because, apart from anything else, that's not a particularly high ceiling. On a military charger, you wouldn't want to go galloping in there, waving a cutlass around and hoping to connect with the right head, or whatever it was you were intending to do. So I've just used the Bristol. This is of course the Bristol riots a week later. Same soldiers, though, same guys. They were a lot more savage in Bristol, but I think it still gives you a flavour of what perhaps was going on. Smith wrote afterwards, "It was so bad at first that the military were compelled to skirmish the mob and recourse to blank cartridges." Now there's a dispute in some accounts as whether they were blank cartridges or live cartridges. But at any rate, they had their guns out. They were certainly slashing around with their sabres. "I fear," he said, "there will all be blood spilt this evening." And Sherborne Mercury wrote afterwards, "Many persons were desperately cut about the head and arms by the sailors." So there was some pretty serious fighting going on, and there were some serious injuries. This was not just some little kind of push and pull, disorder. It was a pretty major conflict. Now, how does all this get remembered locally, in local memory? I think this is interesting. Right? Now, you'll know who Alfred Stevens was, right? Because you come from this place, and he's one of your most famous people. But it was claimed by his friend Frank King. Sorry, if you don't know who he was, he's a sculptor, famous sculptor, became a famous sculptor. But at the time of the riot, he's 13, 14 years old. He's very young. And he had a couple of mates. According to one of them, Frank King, and Harry Atwood is the other. Don't know anything about these people. If anyone does, I can tell us later. But Frank King, recalling in later life, in 1890, casting his mind back, he remembers the three of them were involved in the riot. They were there, 13, 14 years old, chucking rocks at the military. King remembers, he says, the dragoons opening fire. So whether they were blank rounds or live rounds, the effect is the same. You heard the guns being fired. It's not something you heard very often in Blandford, I suspect. The dragoons opening fire on the stone throne of the Anchor Yard. He's very specific. It was the Anchor Yard. This place comes back again and again in contemporary accounts. King remembers himself being chased by a dragoon on horseback. Must have been terrifying, a 14-year-old kid. Being spurred on by a main ringleader called Hokey Pokey. Right, who's that?
Who's Hokey Pokey?
Who's Hokey Pokey? It's not any of you, obviously, who are guilty. Do you know anyone in Blandford called
My great granny married a Horlock, so...
Yeah, I know, right. So it could have been a Horlock. Yeah, it could be one of the... It's just a guess, Horlock is one of the people arrested for riot. One of the few people who was arrested. We'll have a look at them in a moment. And King also remembers what he says, the town was in the hands of the people for 3 days. Very interesting. I mean, a memory obviously well lodged in his subconscious, and a bit of an exaggeration. I think that town wasn't in the hands of the people, but on the other hand, the authorities didn't exactly have the upper hand for very long. So it's an interesting language to use, isn't it? About what he remembers about this incredible event in his youth. So I think that's rather interesting. Right, let's have a look at retribution. So people were arrested, mostly by very small numbers of people, not even official special constables, enrolled special constables, but Charles himself and Smith, young Smith, and one or two other magistrates, getting a couple of gentlemen together with them, and in Articles 3 and 4 they go off to execute warrants. And so they do manage to arrest these people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people in total. The first chap is William Baker, the man who knocked out the lantern. He gets 6 months hard labour, and he's put before the quarter session within a week of the event itself. They put him straight up to the quarter session, and he said, "Oh no, I was a bit drunk at the time." And the magistrate's not interested. He says, "That's tough, mate. You're getting 6 months hard labour." So that's a kind of signal that people weren't going to get off very lightly once they've been arrested, I suppose. Then we get, in the following quarter sessions in January, Richard Blethman, George Long, John Horlock, and John Cherrett. You've got people before the quarter session on reasonably minor charges. You don't put them before the Quarter Session on serious charges. If you want to charge people with a capital offence, you really need to put them before the assize, the twice yearly assize. So that happens later. But these four are dealt with in January, the Quarter Session, on sort of, yes, assault and riot charges. If riot sounds very sort of serious to you, but actually in law, it was always a fairly minor offence, really. So they get their comeuppance, several months in jail between them, with hard labour. And then the spring assize. So there are certain people they've decided to put forward and charge them with capital offences. And this is important because this could have resulted in people being hanged. Capital offence means you can be hanged. For riot, blimey, careful what you do. So I've put in red here what happens to those people who are pulled up before the spring assize on riot charges. First of all, they had Thomas Jackson and William Kent were both up for pulling down, and they used this language, pulling down, or starting to pull down George Moore's house and stealing his papers. Both of them are acquitted on that charge. Now, those were capital charges the court was quite keen to pursue. And one other guy, John Barnes, accused of launching an attack on Chard's house and riot, convicted of the riot but not of launching the attack on Chard's house. So there are complications here for the prosecution, not getting the results they would particularly like. So they do something rather interesting. They take Richard Blethman and George Long, who they've already locked up for riot and assault, and they put them before the assize. They drag them out of their prison cells in order to do this. Pulling down and starting to pull down George Moore's house, the two of them, both convicted and sentenced to die, sentenced to death by hanging. Now that is a big, big deal. There was consternation in the county and outside the county that it was such a harsh punishment for what had been done. These two guys were going to be hanged. Richard Blethman originated in Sturminster Newton. This is a petition signed by 580 people. Don't count, just believe me. 580 people signed this petition praying for the amelioration of sentence, that he would be saved from the gallows and transported instead. There's a big campaign to save him. It's pointed out the only other people who've been hanged for rioting after the Reform Bill was thrown out on October the 8th were at Nottingham and Bristol, and that was by special commission when they brought an assize court specially to find people to hang. That's what you do at a special commission. 3 were hanged at Nottingham and 4 at Bristol. And in Dorset, for the amount of damage Nottingham and Bristol were on fire. Blandford wasn't. John Rutter of Shaftesbury, well-known local radical solicitor, wrote afterwards, the evidence adduced at the trial was considered so slight in support of the capital charge that their counsel called no witnesses on their behalf, either as to fact or to character. Otherwise, no one was expecting. Everyone thought, they're not going to be convicted on the capital charge. There's no evidence worth talking about. So there's complete surprise and consternation. Well, in March 1832, both of them are finally reprieved. Lucky them. We'll come back to them at the end. So a few talking points to round us off. First of all, it's a great picture. First of all, that's not obviously got shot on the streets of Blandford. So, first of all, there's a problem, clearly, isn't there? You can see this. Blandford's not the only town that's going to be having this trouble at this time. There really was a need, most towns felt, I think, to reform the machinery of law and order in the town, the civil power. Enrolling special constables every time things go wrong, it's just so completely unpredictable. So as we know, they couldn't recruit any in Blandford in October 1831. Well, that's weird, because only the previous December, they'd managed in Blandford alone to recruit 1,500 special constables from amongst the right-thinking, morally upright middle class, or whatever it was, that was to combat the threat of the Captain Swing agricultural rebellion, which didn't even come to Blandford in the end. But there was obviously a fit. So you can say, well, it's not just disorder, it's what they go, well, what sort of disorder? Before I enrolled as a special constable and have somebody beat me up. What sort of disorder? So the special constable system is a bit unpredictable. On the other hand, if you don't manage to recruit a civil power worth talking about, just armed with a truncheon and a pair of handcuffs, then you've only got the military to call upon. But then you've got the problem of what if the military overreact, or even if it's not really an overreaction, but if they start killing people, the town is not going to forgive them, and it's not going to forgive you, the magistrate, for calling them in the first place. So law and order is an issue in early 19th century England that many people realise needs to be sorted out, and you will probably know that we are in the era of the development of professional police forces. Metropolitan Police, founded by Robert Peel in 1829, that's only for London of course, and then after the Municipal Reform Act of 1835, every municipal borough is expected to establish a watch committee, and every watch committee is expected to establish a professional police force, a paid police force, trained police force, not just special constables. So that happens after about 1836, so we're in that era. Richard Blethman and George Long, what about them? Why were they singled out? One reason, if you look back over all the depositions, the pre-trial depositions, the witness statements, the comments made by magistrates, these two names come up over and over again. Now this is either because they're looking for someone they go, it's him. Let's say he was there, I saw him there, and I saw him there as well. We're trying to put together a package of people we can prosecute. So whether they were in all these places or not, it's hotly disputed in court. But they apparently are seen and recognised in multiple sightings during the riot, including the attack on poor Richard Shipler, the farmer, on Saturday on Market Day. They've also blotted their copybooks by not being afraid to assault magistrates. Bastard, Hannam, Smith all claim they were assaulted, hit with sticks or punched by these two guys. George Long, when he's arrested, is in possession of a firearm. He claims that he took the gun from a man who was trying to defend a house and aiming it at the crowd, and he relieved that man of the gun, and that's why he was carrying it. He wasn't going to shoot anyone with it, and when told to throw it down, he did. But didn't look good in court when it was reported that he was in possession of a firearm and arrested. He also had a previous conviction. In 1828, he'd been arrested and convicted of letting off fireworks in a disorderly manner on November the 5th, part of another disorderly crowd, and that went against him too, I think. But here's another thing. Another reason why it didn't have to be them, but it had to be somebody you could carry a conviction against on the capital charge. You had to have somebody, because otherwise the people whose houses were attacked would never be able to claim full compensation for the injury. Damage compensation during a riot was payable only if a capital conviction was secured for, in the phrase, starting to pull down a house. So you had to prove that what the perpetrator was doing wasn't just breaking some windows, it was trying to pull the house down, destroy the house, demolish the house. So simple riot, simple window breaking were unlikely to be enough. So we need to think a little bit about window breaking. This comes down to a piece of mistaken legislation passed quite recently by Sir Robert Peel, one of Peel's police reforms, 1827, the Malicious Injuries to Property Act. This is an act which states that it becomes for the first time a capital felony to, quote, unlawfully and with force demolish or begin to demolish a private house. And that's the charge that was launched against both Blethman and Long. It becomes a capital offence. If a capital offence is proven, then compensation to the victim will be equal to the extent of the damage caused, but it is conditional on proof of felonious intent. Okay? If the attempt to prove felony fails, if the capital charge fails, then the victim can only be awarded compensation to the tune of £5 or less. And that comes from the defendant. So the magistrate orders the defendant to pay £5. Even if plate glass windows to the cost of £200 have been destroyed, that wasn't an attempt to pull down the house. That was only an attempt to cause economic damage to the windows. So the magistrate then orders the defendant to pay £5 compensation, nothing like enough. And if the defendant just says, I haven't got any money, then he gets 2 months hard labour in jail. But not hanged. There's a difference, isn't there? And having pressed that charge and successfully convicted Blethman and Long on that charge, as we see here, later in March, a sheriff's court held at Dorchester, the following sums were awarded as a remuneration for the damages sustained. Colonel Cleveland, £76 9 shillings. Not a fiver. Septimus Smith, Esquire, £186. George Moore, £283, 2 shillings and 3. I mean, not a fiver. So let's think about the rationale of the crowd then. Let's just think, because we always think of crowds. What is a crowd? What are crowds like? Disorderly people. First of all, I'm going to say that the crowd appear to have felt they had a legitimate grievance, a legitimate case. There's a sense of legitimacy about the crowd. They're not just out to cause trouble on Friday night because they have a few beers. They have a real grievance in their own eyes. They have a grievance, and it's a grievance about the running of the Dorset County election. But it's a grievance which is widely reported in the newspaper press, the respectable newspaper press, as though indeed it is a legitimate grievance. I give you the Western Times. Mr. S. Smith and Mr. Moore, 2 attorneys, advocates for Lord Ashley, have, during the examination of the voters, disclosed many confidential communications which they had acquired professionally as attorneys. The town, since justly annoyed at such conduct, have broken into their offices, justly annoyed at their conduct, have broken into their offices, taken all their papers, scattered them around the streets of Blandford. Nothing can be more disgraceful than such conduct as was pursued by these attorneys at the election. But we regret that it should have entailed such serious consequences. Well, yes, interesting. George Moore sued the Western Times for libel for this particular remark and got away with it too. Again, just on the sense of legitimacy, listen to what the crowd say. When you get a chance, it's hard they never speak with, generally riotous, it's hard to, what do they say? What do they think? What are they arguing? It's hard to tell quite often, but you do hear them. You see, according to Reverend Chard, the bailiff, he says the crowd rallied directly and shouted, "The King and Reform, and the soldiers will not hurt us." A sense that surely the soldiers won't attack us, we're only doing the right thing. We're not really misbehaving seriously. The King and Reform, we're patriots. The King is a reformer. We're all reformers. Only the Tory lords are not reformers. It's not fair. It's not right. We are in the right here. We also have to think about their behaviour. I mean, do they just run amok around the town? No, they don't just run amok around the town. Interestingly, do they loot? No. No evidence of looting whatsoever. Some destruction of property, destroyed property, but looting, no. So this is not a crowd out of control by any means, is it? They have certain restraints around their behaviour which they stick with. They only attack the houses of prominent supporters of Lord Ashley. I'm not belittling that, but they don't attack anybody. They're very careful about who they attack, and in the end it's not that many houses. And when they do attack the house, until military intervention appears, they're not doing anything other than breaking windows. The first instance is to break the windows. Now, we start thinking is, so do they know that they can't be hanged for breaking windows? Is that a restraint on their behaviour? It does make an interesting question. And the final thing about the rationale of the crowd I think, is that whole thing, okay, what did they have to gain? The Reform Bill wasn't going to help them, was it? These are working class people. The Reform Bill was only ever going to enfranchise middle class men. Householders with property worth £10 on the rates or more per year. What have they got to... I think that when you hear working people in the 1830s shouting for reform, they don't just mean, we want a fairer voting system. What they're saying is, we want the world to change. We want a lot of things reformed. We want reform. We want the world reformed, remade, reconditioned. They've got plenty of things. If you want to give them a list of things to complain about, it's not just that. And there's also, I think, the possibility. So if we say that reform basically was a watchword for change, for evolution, or for revolution, for movement, for forward movement, it was also possible for people to see that the Reform Bill was a kind of gateway legislation. It's not that it was going to benefit them directly, personally, but if we made voting fairer and we made representation fairer, and we therefore made Parliament more accountable and more representative, then that Parliament will surely pass laws which do favour people further down the pecking order. That's perfectly... They would soon find this wasn't so. but you can understand that there is a kind of thought, well, it's not a vote for me, but it's a vote for my employer. And my employer is a decent man, and he will see that we are all righted further down the road. I'm going to hand over to Roger for the last couple of slides.
So I've been looking at who were the rioters, which is really important. We've got these fantastic tools today, like Ancestry and Find My Past, and lots of availability of sources. So we can look at samples of the riot. And what we're left with this riot, Steve showed you, was I think 9 arrestees. So they're quite small samples, and we've got our 3 friends, Alfred Stevens, Francis King, Frank King, and Harvey Aplin, who are named. But apart from that, we don't really know any other names. So we've got 12 people. So of those 12, obviously they're all named, but that doesn't mean that women weren't involved. So for descriptions of the crowd, sometimes tell you that we're involved. Women were involved in some stages of this riot, I believe. So 9 arrestees, 3 others. And just looking at their occupations tells you something straight away, which is that we've got a bunch of artisans here. So butchers and shoemakers, blacksmiths, gunsmiths, apprentices. So our 3 young people, I think, were all apprentices. Francis King was a gunsmith apprentice for the Pegler family, and I think Alfred was a kind of apprentice painter, because his father was a railway painter and sign maker. We've got 3 labourers, and one we're not quite sure about yet. So we've got artisans and labourers. That's exactly what we found in Sherborne as well. Sherborne is pretty much, I imagine, what we'll find when we look at Yeomanry. So we're not talking about the respectable middle classes out in the streets angry about reform, or Whigs out in the streets angry about reform because they want to make the parliamentary system in their favour. We're talking about the working classes of various types, the skilled and unskilled working class. They're quite young, most of them. So we've got 3 13-year-olds. I think John Barnes was the oldest at 29. So a lot, when riots happen, the general response, you'll hear it right to this day, is it wasn't people from Blandford that did it. It was people from somewhere else. It would be the Irish, Australians during the First World War, I think. Somebody from somewhere else, right? Well, that is generally not the case. And in this case, because this was one of the first riots that kicked off in Sherborne, we had Pack Monday Fair going, so people all over Dorset were there. But this one, in Blandford, it was 11 people from Blandford. I think the 12th might have been from Blandford St Mary. Anyway, so there we go. Across the river. It's like South Bristol. Right, so they're all from Blandford, so there's no kind of nonsense here. It was like people from outside. They're mostly single men, but unlike Sherborne, we had only one person who had a couple of kids who was married, but the rest was single, fairly in their 20s. This is really interesting. I'll come on to it in the next slide why, but so how many of them had a criminal record? Because obviously riots are done by criminals, aren't they? but they're not. In fact, in this case again, we found the same in Sherborne about, I mean, I say 2 to 3, I'm not sure about one of them. I think John Barnes might have been done for dastardly, which I believe running away and leaving a wife and kids behind. But anyway, so basically a majority here had no criminal record. What about literacy? Well, literacy in Dorset was actually quite good relative to other southern counties, but I've only been able to track maybe 2 that were semi-literate, let's say. So probably illiterate, most of them, not necessarily all of them, probably artisans are more likely to be literate. How many of these people had the vote? None of them, apart from perhaps Blandford's father, Thomas Blandford, I think, was a voter. We haven't quite proved that, but maybe Barry will tell us later. But basically didn't have the vote, what a surprise, and their families in general didn't have the vote either. And I mentioned, as Steve mentioned, Alfred Stevens, a very interesting figure, comes from an artisanal background, and then his money is raised and he's sent off to Italy and becomes a famous sculptor. But I think this event clearly stayed in his mind and found guns till he died. And obviously had a similar effect, I imagine, on hundreds of people in Blandford. So it mustn't be forgotten. There's sometimes subterranean histories that exist in towns that aren't in, perhaps in the Victorian County history or whatever. I just want to say the last slide now is this project is an interdisciplinary project, and it's applying ideas that have been much more contemporarily used to understand how crowds and riots, how crowds work, and how protests can turn into violence, and similarly why they don't turn into violence, and how riots spread. So a bit of social psychology here. So I'm just going to throw out some myths now about riots you might recognise when you read the newspapers. We had a few riots about 10 years ago, didn't we? I think 2011. There was some in Bristol the other day as well last year. So you continually see the same things said. And most of these ideas come from 19th century French sociologists. So if you have recognised these ideas, that's where they came from, and they were not empirically based. They weren't based on people actually doing experiments or observing crowds. They were perceptions by posh people about how the lower orders operate. So any spark can cause a riot. It was a tinderbox. Well, that's just not the case. I mean, riots are really rare things, and there are reasons they're rare. So in this case, you can see that although there were riots, the rejection of reform bills sort of created the conditions, perhaps, for disturbances or for protests to become riots, but it was local effects that determined whether they actually did happen or not. And we talk about 3 levels a lot of the time to try and understand this sometimes. So in this case, the macro level, sort of background, you might argue that the reason these members of the working class and lower classes are reacting is because of the social conditions they live in. I'm not going to go into the details of Blandford, but I noticed when I was going through the other day that your town was full of rookeries. Right? Well, this is a middle class term for where poor people live. There's thieves and ruffians, but they're living in terrible conditions sometimes. Certainly in Sherborne, when I looked, the conditions were awful that the people lived in. Massive overcrowding, no sanitation, all sorts of stuff like that. So there can be a lot of background conditions. That doesn't mean there's going to be a riot, but certainly I call this the meso level, the next level down. So you've got the background conditions that might create unrest. And clearly 1831 was a period where, as Steve said, reform is on the agenda. People are maybe getting the perception that things are going to get better, that somehow they're going to get something out of this, that they won't be struggling to feed their children, which is what caused the swing riots. So there's a perception that things were changing, and then of course there's a defeat in the House of Lords, which sort of says, well no, it's not being changed. Who's stopping us getting change? Is in people's minds, and in their minds it is the Tory Lords, the Tory clergy, the Tory landowners, and that's what's in people's head. These people are stopping us getting reform. Now they might be completely wrong about what was going to happen, but that was probably a perception. So that creates the conditions for unrest across Britain. And finally, down here in Dorset, we have this election, which obviously people were participating in, most of which they couldn't vote, but they saw it as, kind of as speaking of a microcosm of what was going on in the country. So when the result came in, and it was highly, there there was significant questions about corruption. And though Steve said he won by 36 votes, there were like 500 contested votes, of which the majority were for the Reform candidate. So it was seen. So that process can lead to the situation where a riot might occur. Then after that, what the authorities do is really important. But quickly back onto criminals, right? This is the idea of convergence. So this idea says that was around, again, comes from our French sociologist and American sociologist around the time of the Second World War, and that's the idea that riots happen because criminals gather together and do criminal things. But obviously, when we've got, they found this when they studied riots in the 60s in America in great detail, they found that most of the rioters in general weren't criminals, and in fact they were generally better educated than the other people in their community. So, went right against that. And again, here you look at that and say, okay, we haven't got many criminals, have we? We haven't got a convergence of criminals necessarily, which is a surprise to the draconian legal conditions of the time, where you could get literally transported for stealing a duck. So, people were likely to get a criminal record. Indiscriminate, mindless behaviour. They were feral. They're animals. This is submergence. This is the idea, all of you, this is submergence. Right? What it means is underneath your kind and slightly bored characters at the moment, you are raging beasts. At the moment the law is removed and you're put in the right situation, you will turn into Dr. Hydes all over. This is Hydes everywhere. So that's another French sociologist idea. But of course, what you do see in riots, as Steve has shown very clearly, is that there were limits to everything they did. First of all, they were selective. If you're selectively attacking targets, how can you be mindlessly indiscriminate? How can you be feral if you're selecting which house to attack? Now, I don't say I agree with it, but that's certainly not feral behaviour or irrational, random violence. It's not like that. So there are limits, also limits to the amount of violence they used. I mean, you've got to remember, the state is offering to hang two of these people. How many people did the rioters kill? Does anyone know how many people were killed by the swing riot? Zero. So there are limits to what people do, and that tells you about rationality from their perspective and what they think is legitimate. And that shows. So always look for things like, when you look at a riot, if one comes up next week, have a look at what they don't attack. Have a look at what the rioters don't attack. They weren't burning people's houses down, were they? They weren't looting. So something interesting is going on, there's limits. And finally, contagion. This is the idea that the riots just, you watch something on television, tonight you get back, watch the news, there's a riot on, you'll suddenly run out and start rioting. Copycat rioting is called. It's the idea that riots spread merely through gathering or seeing information about a riot, or talking to somebody who's been in a riot. Well, as I said, they're very rare, and there are waves of riots. What's interesting here is that the fact we looked at nearly 500 protests, riots and disturbances in Britain and Ireland over this period, this autumn of 1831. And the vast majority are peaceful. They're parades and demonstrations and meetings. So the vast majority were not riots. A small number were. And it is interesting why they occurred. And this is true of Dorset. I mean, though there were riots in some towns in Dorset, there were a lot of towns where there weren't riots, but there were protests and the formation of political unions. And the thing to think about, a much better way of understanding riots than these kind of very outdated and quite wrong concepts, is to think more about the crowd itself. Why are they there? Who are the crowd? What does that tell you? What's their agenda? Don't assume their agenda is the same as what the newspapers say or what a political party says. But what's their agenda? What are they trying to do? Who's there? And what is their social identity? How do they understand themselves? How do they understand the idea of reform in this case? And therefore, if you understand those things, you'll understand why they chose certain targets they decided they were legitimate. So that's what social identity is about. It's about thinking more about the crowd than trying to characterise it from outside or turn it into some kind of feral, mindless mob. So the word mob is out the crowd is in. Nationality is on the table from the perspective of the crowd, as is their own social identity, as is what they regard as legitimate, as is their life experience that put them there in the first place. So that's it really, thanks for that.
That's it. There is it. We're very happy to take questions, aren't we, Roger?
Yes.
We are. But I want to call on Barry first.
Okay.
Because you've got something to say before.
That's right, because they're out in Australia this evening.
Barry, do you want to come out?
Yes,
Address the crowd.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you very much. Out in Australia this evening, there are two individuals who are very interested in the talk this evening, and that's because they are descendants of Richard Blethman. Okay. And they in fact have sent a message to you this evening, which with your permission I would like to read out.
Got the lights up, Barry?
No, I'm fine. Better in the dark. The two individuals are Ria and Bill Blethman. Ria lives in Melbourne, and she's a management consultant and company director. And Bill is the retired director of the Museum and Art Gallery of Tasmania. So as a family, they've done quite well. So Ria writes, "It's lovely to learn that Richard's story will be discussed in an open forum in the very neighbourhood from which he was banished for life. Something of a spiritual homecoming for him and closure for our family. It's also pleasing that after nearly 2 centuries, the convict stain is being removed from these poor souls. I'm still astounded that Richards was doing a capital crime and that he only just dodged the hangman's noose. So nice to hear from you, and I hope you're doing fine despite all the upsets in your country." So they know what's going on. We also shared your grief with the loss of the Queen. She was our head of state as well, and was held in high esteem by many. Nevertheless, her passing has prompted serious debate in this country about replacing our own family as head of state with our own homegrown version. Tongue-in-cheek, Ria says, "Given Bill and I are descended from convict royalty, we are waiting with great anticipation for the happening. Watch this space." The talk by Steve and Roger from the University of the West of England reinforces our shared passion for history and that it's always evolving and demands constant interpretation and reinterpretation. More recently, history seems to be less focused on the great man view, but rather an alternative view from the victims and downtrodden. Richard's story, given life by this work, is part of that new pattern. Much of our continent is enduring flooding and devastating impacts on local communities. It is a truism that Australia is a land of drought, punctuated by flooding. As an child, I chuckled at the attached photo of Bill and I, as our maternal grandfather of non-convict stock, used to joke that vintage photos of Blethmans are always from the waist up, so their convict veins aren't visible. Although our photo is taken waist up, rest assured we are no longer wearing convict chains. Please pass on our best regards to the folk of Blandford town and let them know we are quite honoured and humbled by the interest shown in our forebear. It would be nice to visit the Old Dart sometime soon. I understand Old Dart is Aussie speak for the old country. Bill has just added, I hope the attendees of the discussion realise the significance that Richard's actions, arrest and ultimate banishment have had on this island perched on the edge of the Southern Ocean. Next stop, Antarctica. There are now 7 generations of Lethmans scattered around the island. All of this because a judge overturned his capital punishment sentence on the day he was to be hung, thanks only to the people of Blandford for so strongly supporting 2 petitions. Ria and I wish all well and are very much hoping to make our own pilgrimage to Blandford if and when a degree of normality returns to our world. I'm sure when Bill and Ria eventually make it to Blandford, they'll get a warm welcome.
Right. Do you mind if I just take a quick photograph of you all? Is that a problem?
If you don't want to be in a photograph, bury your head in your hands now.
Do you want the lights up?
Oh yeah, that's all right. Yeah. So I'm not very good at this.
Top buttons, Charlie.
Now let's see.
Cheers.
Is this for anyone wanting?
Well, it's just nice.
It's a joke.
Actually, if you pushed all that, wave it.
That's
You
good.
should. Do it again.
Got it. You're going to wave that. Brilliant.
So everyone wave it up.
Everybody wave.
Wave to that. Wave to Bad Demons, Cheers.
We did find out what happened to George Long. His is a less fortunate tale. He had a lot of clashes with authority during his time as a convict, so he spent a long time before he got his ticket for leave. Once he was released, he got himself a job as a seaman on a sailing vessel that sailed between Melbourne on the mainland and it was Launceston in northern Tasmania. Sadly, he was only in the job for 2 months when he was involved in a nasty accident, and he fell through the hull of the vessel that he was working on. He was quite badly injured. He was taken away to hospital after a couple of days, where sadly he passed away. There's no trace of marrying or of any offspring. So sadly there are not as many longs in Tassie as there are Lethmans. Thanks very much.
So we can do some quick questions.
Yes, you made great play of the targeting of the rioters. Have you been able to identify any ringleaders? Because the rioters, there's William Baker, William Kent, age 16, Baker, and he was charged with destroying the papers. He would have been illiterate. Who would have told him? And the rioters weren't reading The Guardian every morning to know what was going on in Parliament. Where were the pamphleteers? Where were the ringleaders? Was it Ponsonby? Ponsonby men whipping them up? Because it seems too good to be a spontaneous riot, too targeted.
No, it wasn't spontaneous. You have to imagine this was a world in which the only talk in every coffee house, tavern, inn, hotel, in the marketplace was reform.
Yeah.
The reform crisis. Whichever side on which you stood, that was what people were talking about. And there was no shortage of information and misinformation swirling around about what was happening. So you don't worry too much about whether people were highly literate or... The other thing about literacy, literacy is a blunt term for understanding what people could and couldn't read. There's often a sort of sense that people could read a certain amount, but they couldn't read very much. Or they could sign their names and write a couple of words, but they hadn't learned very much. There are levels of literacy, which when you say people weren't literate or they were literate, you kind of skate through that rather. But I think that what we know very well that pamphlets, broadsides written in very simple language often with illustrations, and newspapers were read aloud in coffee houses and pubs and taverns. You know, whoever has the gift of reading is the one who reads it out, and everyone else stands around and listens, going, "God, did you hear that?" You know that. There's no. I wouldn't be surprised that there's a shortage. You know, there's no shortage of information. I would say. As to who were the ringleaders, hokey pokey.
Can I ask two questions? One of which is the situation in Anchor Gateway.
Yeah.
Now, I hadn't realised that actually the shots were fired, because I didn't think there was anything like that. Now, if the dragoons actually were using weapons, they were pretty poor shots, as no one got injured by that. And I don't think there was any note of any injuries of people within that area, were there?
Well, we think people were badly hurt by sabre work, not with bullets, as far as we know. But what you have to also remember is that when soldiers are ordered to fire, in those situations, it's expected they'll fire over the heads, not directly into the room. No one will kill anyone. They really don't. If they must, but they don't intend to do that. So usually the idea is to fire over the heads. Just the sound of the gun should be enough to scatter the crowd. That's the thought. So if they did open fire, and it seems that, so what we don't know is whether they were live rounds or blank. Discrepancy in that. How would we know? If no one was actually felled by a bullet, we wouldn't know whether it was a live round or a blank, would we? But the usual thing was to fire over the heads. There were instances in
But it's important to say in Bristol they did fire at people. They did shoot.
Well, yeah, because I mean, presumably if they had shot at people, you'd have another Peterloo on your hands here in Blandford.
Right.
So it didn't quite approach that situation, did it?
No, but it did in Bristol 2 weeks later. So I think there's talk about bullet holes in, there was a lot of discussion over the years. I think Barry knows a bit about this, about bullet holes in Anchor Yard, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was a previous town clerk called Charles Lavington, and he wrote his sort of memoirs, and he did talk about it in his article about bullet holes in Anchor Yard.
And the other question I'd like to ask was about the fact of questioning by one side of the amount of votes that were not permitted because of the question of having mortgages and the one solicitor being in charge of those fact-finding. Did that ever appear anywhere else? Was it a common phenomenon in other elections at that time or throughout the 19th century?
Yeah, it was normal to have assessors, because anyone who turns up and says, "I'm so-and-so, and I've got a bunch of votes," you had to have, there was an expectation that you had some evidence if you were challenged about it. It's just that on this occasion it was a particularly controversial time to be, and you could see it was being manipulated politically. Both sides were actually at it. Ponsonby was also trying to disqualify anti-reformers, but I think Ashley had the better of it. He was better connected, and he was certainly doing it to.
And it was the number of objective votes. So people said, "Okay, we're willing to accept 100, but it was 5 times that number." It was something towards 500. You've got 36 votes in terms of the election. So 500 objections. That's what people were looking at. Going necessarily wrong here.
Before you ask a question, I have absolutely got to go, but Roger doesn't.
Just a quick question. Don't you think this started more at ground level when the mechanisation started to bite around the early 1800s? And the theft of land from the people, the common land by the enclosure walls. Don't you feel that this is a lot more at ground level than the middle class with property and stuff? I don't know, it's just food for thought.
Yeah, they're all relevant.
Before relevant to this.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's only a thought.
Sorry, yeah. I just wanted to raise a question. I'm not sure if there's an answer. Sorry. But I was thinking about people's willingness to actually riot, or in fact to demonstrate. I wonder if in fact that there are certain parts of the world, in certain situations where people don't demonstrate. There's a kind of apathy or fear. Other parts of the world where they do. And I wonder whether there's, that some parts of the world, that you can actually demonstrate because you might be able to get a result that you won't demonstrate if you're not going to achieve anything, or if in fact the costs of demonstration are going to be so good. I'm thinking about Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Now, someone said some time ago that in Ukraine they would always be prepared. I think about the Maidan uprising in Ukraine. They would, they're not apathetic. They're always prepared, in fact, stand up for what they conceive as their rights. In Belarus, it's they are not quite so willing to come out on the streets. Whereas in Russia, at the moment, they're incredibly apathetic, and it may be because they don't think that what they're trying to do will achieve anything.
Well, I think you've also got Iran on the table as well, isn't it? I mean, that's a very repressive regime where people are actually demonstrating, hundreds of people are being killed, but they're still doing
Yes, 2 o'clock tomorrow, if anybody wants to go for a walk and handle that again. I'm sorry, I'm running away because I've got dinner booked at the town. Start serving soon, my So thank you everybody, and thanks for coming, and please see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I'd like to tell the argument goes that it's a very repressive regime, people, won't demonstrate, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean,
Which is why
it takes two to tango, doesn't it? I mean, these crowd events are not just what the crowd does, what the authorities do. And so, at the moment in Iran, extremely brave, mainly young men and women, mainly women doing this stuff and getting killed, So what are they doing it for? Well, what they're doing it for is they want to overthrow the regime and change their lives. And what was going on here is, as I said, these people weren't going to benefit directly from what was going on. And that's always intrigued me about these reform rights. You were putting yourself on the line and you could be executed. I mean, as I said, you don't think people were going to be executed. 19 people were executed only a few months before in southern England for the swing riots, and 292 people sentenced to death. And those swing rioters killed no one. Right, so that's what you've got to remember. This is a very repressive regime. We're now in the 1830s. God knows what it was like in the 1730s if you look at the bloody code. So Britain was significantly repressive, but not the most repressive in Europe. There were more repressive regimes. And I think what happened in Britain is that Steve will argue this now, is that they were quite clever how they used their very repressive legal system. So, for example, you'll find, if you look at figures for capital offences in the 18th century, that for every 19 people given a death sentence, only one of them would be hanged. The other 18 would be transported as forced labourers. So a nice little system operating. They needed forced labour from the colonies. So they wanted to use examples of people. It's a bit like in the First World War, how the British Army dealt with desertion. So it shot around 300 odd people, its own soldiers, but it was very careful not to shoot too many, because that could cause unrest or mutiny in the ranks. So they shot a quota, in fact, in the First World War. They shot enough people that they regarded would pick people off from deserting. So that was a desertion. And AWOL in the First World War in the British Army was very high. So it's about that relationship, isn't it? I think the British authorities are very skilled in applying terror at the top, which is the gallows. At the top of the system is terror, but applying that so that they can keep control. And that's why these riots are interesting, because they mostly come about because the authorities aren't really in control. They make wrong decisions, or they are clearly divided. So the people who ran Blandford were divided, weren't they? There were those who, so why did no one come forward as special constables? Well, it's because all the sort of Whig families, or pro, the ones who voted Whig, who were the majority in Blandford, said, well, they're not attacking us. We're not the ones who wrecked the reform bill. We're not the ones who filled the election in Dorset. It was the Tories that did that. The Tory gentry and the Tory clergy. So they're going to pay for this. They expect us to run out, pick up a big stick and defend them. They're a bit silly, aren't they? Why should I run out and defend a corrupt regime? It's corrupt. We need a better system. So that's why these riots happened to a certain extent, was that the people who ran Blandford were divided. And that was the same Sherborne, same Yeovil, so with divisions. And those three towns, interestingly, Yeovil, well, all of them, Poole, Sherborne, Yeovil and Blandford, were majority voters mostly pro-reform in those towns. So that may be why things developed into riots in these towns, because the people around the town are divided.
The other point is that Lord Portland was a major employer in the town.
Yeah.
And I wondered how much discussion was going on on his estate, you know, of what was happening.
Well, we saw the same thing in Sherborne, that the major employers in the silk mills, actually one of them, Thomas Wilmot, he actually pretty much stopped the riot in Sherborne. I mean, he seems to have been able to negotiate with the rioters and got them to go home in the end. Probably because that was the point where the dragoons who were in Sherborne would have been opening fire on them. They were told that they would shoot you. So it's interesting that sometimes the factory owners were more progressive, supported reform, were able to talk to the people and say, look, we don't want the bodies for the, we don't want the streets for the bodies tomorrow. And as they said, that will not be forgotten. It wasn't forgotten in Manchester, and it certainly hasn't been forgotten in Bristol. There's been a good attempt to try and forget in Bristol from the biggest massacre since the Battle of Culloden in Bristol. We still don't know how many people died in Bristol, but there were hundreds of killed and wounded in Bristol. Possibly up to, according to the commander, who was an expert in cavalry warfare, Colonel Mackworth, he said there might have been up to 800 people killed and wounded in Bristol, mostly wounded. So these were major events, so that won't be forgotten. It wasn't forgotten in Bristol, but there was an attempt to try and write it out as a riot. It was just a riot. It was put down. So I think what I'm interested about Blandford, I think what Steve was touching on, which is that how much of those memories, obviously those memories passed through people like Frank King, Alfred Stevens, and may have influenced them in their lives, but how much of those memories carry on in the subterranean level? And certainly in Bristol we come across stories, clearly that story was not been about in the 1890s, so did it survive, I don't know. And there's another angle, which is international, which is as a result of the transportations. So. Anyway, I'm going to sharpen this one. Any other questions?
Women's suffrage and the way in which the government misplayed that.
Well, yeah, it's certainly wasn't really. You've got to remember the Whigs aren't really into this for any kind of universal suffrage. They're just not interested. There are some radical Whigs who are. What they're interested in is reorganising the voting system to gain advantage. So
I was thinking more about the way in which government created martyrs.
Yeah.
And the martyrdom went on. Something I wasn't aware of was the number of explosions triggered by women's suffrage.
Oh, the suffragette bombing, yeah. And arsonists.
And that was a direct result of the way in which the government had treated the women.
That's true, and I also think that the suffrage movement is seen in a particular light. It's been obviously now part of our social history and our political history, but the real content of it is somewhat suppressed because it's not very nice. So, people were bombing and blowing things up and burning things down to try and get the vote, right? And that tells you, the way it's often thought about is to try and ignore that, because it's a bit unsavoury, but actually should not be ignored, because what you're seeing there is the difficulty in getting things changed, right? So the fact is that people are starting to burn and bomb things, right, and think about murdering politicians, in fact, to try and get the vote. Well, why do you need to go to those lengths to get the vote in this country? Why do these people, who had no chance of getting the vote, have to go to these lengths to drive the whole thing forward? Because it was partly because of the unrest, but certainly the protest movement, that the Great Reform Act goes through the next year. I mean, the King is saying to the Tories, you've had it. You think you'll never get back into power without agreeing to reform, you can forget it, because we're going to, if you carry on the way you're going, i.e. stopping the process of reform, there will be revolution in this country. That's what's going on in 1832, if you look into it. You know, the reformers are saying, if you don't do this, there's going to be revolution. And the king is saying to the Tories, you've got to do it. And in the end, Wellington gets it. And he goes round, basically, along with his other whips, and whips them into line with the Lords and says, shit, you can't oppose this anymore. It's too dangerous. Otherwise, we'll end up with militant leaders and people. And I think they were fine with that. And Bristol terrified them. What happened with Bristol terrified them. So they could run around and say, oh, look at this is what reform looks like, chaos, burning, but actually in their heads they were thinking that'll be us next, you know. Might be our heads on some spikes. So I think that did have an impact on the Tory party and move things along. But I'm going to finish there because what I wanted to say was it's been brilliant just over the last few weeks working with the team from the museum here, who've been brilliant because they've been putting this display up several times. They've learned more about their money, but it's just great to come tonight and put a brilliant event on. But just the whole team doing all the food and everything, it's just great. This is brilliant stuff, isn't it? That's it.